Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the Gospel of Luke and chapter 18. Luke's Gospel, chapter 18. One thing we hear a lot about today, and I'm sure we can all relate to it to some extent at least, is the desire and the demand for justice. For example, just in case you think, no, I'm not really into that, let's imagine that following the service you return to the car park only to discover that your car is not there. And in shock, you look up and you catch a glimpse of it disappearing round the corner at the end of the street. In other words, someone has stolen it and is driven away in it. So what do? You call the police. And their reply is, I'm sorry, but due to a lot going on this morning, Sunday morning, due to a lot going on, there's not much we can do about it. And what is your response? Do you just shrug your shoulders and say, well, not to worry, as long as someone is getting the use of my car, that's fine? Is that how you would respond? I doubt it. Because you know your car has been stolen. And regardless of how much it was worth, your sense of justice tells you that that's wrong, and therefore you've been wronged and you feel it deeply. You turn on the news and you hear of people in various parts of the world treating other human beings terribly, ruthlessly, committing the very worst of crimes, demonstrating the worst example of man's inhumanity to man, and yet because of their position or because of their power or because of their financial clout, they get away with it. And how do you respond? Do you think to yourself, well, it's maybe not my preferred way of doing things, but if that's how they want to behave, then that's up to them? Is that how you would respond? I very much doubt it. Because deep down you know that such actions are morally wrong, and consequently you're appalled and you're angry at what you hear. And what is more, you're not only angry that such crimes are being committed, you're also angry that people can commit such crimes and get away with it. You're angry, and rightly so, because your sense of justice not only tells you that certain things are wrong, it also tells you that such wrongs ought to be put right. That's at least how the woman in our parable for today felt. That's how she felt. Which brings me to my first point this morning, and that is the Christian's desire for justice to be done. The Christian's desire for justice to be done. Now, as this parable begins, we are introduced to a judge who neither feared God nor cared about men. Here was a judge who had no sense of accountability towards his Creator, and therefore his work was not governed by God-given principles of justice or morality. It wasn't clear God-given distinctions between right and wrong that motivated this man to pursue a career in the law profession. Instead, he entered the profession and performed his professional duties from day to day purely on pragmatic grounds. And that pragmatism was almost certainly a selfish pragmatism. And I say that because in addition to having no fear of God, we are also told he did not care about men. Yeah, this judge, he wasn't governed by a sense of justice or compassion. He wasn't motivated by a desire to serve his community. He wasn't driven by a longing to help his fellow citizens. He had no sympathy whatsoever towards those who were being conned. And neither did he have any desire to bring to justice those who were doing the conning. After all, it would have been rather hypocritical for him to judge the corrupt when he himself was probably as corrupt as anyone. Here was a judge who made rulings and passed judgments on the basis of what benefited him the most. That is why this little parable is often called the parable of the unjust judge. But then living in that town was a woman, a widow, and from what we are told in verse 3, it appears that although she does not have a husband, she does have an adversary. Someone whom she's in a legal dispute with, and from what she says, it appears that she's in the right and the other person in the wrong. This woman has been treated unfairly. This woman has been treated unjustly. And being a widow, she doesn't have anyone to stand up for her. She doesn't have anyone to defend her rights. She doesn't have anyone to ensure that she gets justice. But then she thinks to herself one day, hang on a minute. That's what judges are for, is it not? Yes, that's what judges are for. And so she brings her case to the local judge. But being a judge who neither fears God nor cares about men, he's not interested in her case. Not interested. It's certainly not on top of his to-do list when he goes into work on a Monday morning, and consequently her request for justice is simply ignored. But that doesn't diminish her sense of justice. And that doesn't diminish her desire for justice to be done. And so we are told in verse 3, she kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. What we see in the case of this woman is a woman longing for justice to be done. And what could possibly be the relevance of that for those disciples to whom Jesus was telling the story? What could possibly be the relevance of that to those of us who are followers of Jesus Christ this morning? Well, that is where the context of the previous passage comes in. You see, as I've said on previous occasions, the parables of Jesus must not be read, although we often do, they must not be read in isolation. Instead, they should be read and understood with their original context. And if that is true of the parables in general, then it's certainly true of this parable at the start of Luke chapter 18. And I say that because this parable has perhaps been misunderstood and misused over the years. Well, in one sense, this parable should be one of the easiest to understand because we are explicitly told in verse 1 why Jesus told it. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. And if you just start your reading at chapter 18, verse 1, and if you read the little 8 verses on their own, then on that basis we've perhaps concluded that no matter what I'm praying for, I should keep on praying for it. And on the basis of what happens in this parable, I can assume that if I pray loud enough, and if I pray long enough about it, I'll eventually get what I'm praying for. That's the point of the parable, is it not? And so the next logical conclusion is that if you've started praying for that Ferrari, or that particularly well-paid job, or that young man or woman that you've recently met and have taken a liking to and think would make a good marriage partner, or that revival that you've read about in the past and would love to see happening in your locality and in your lifetime, if you've started to pray for any of those things, then keep praying for them, because on the basis of what happens in this little story, you can assume that you'll eventually get what you're praying for. Now, let me just say that some of those prayer matters I've just mentioned are more justified than others. Okay? And some of them are certainly things that we should be praying about. But to conclude on the basis of this parable that if we pray loud enough and long enough for those things, we'll eventually get them, is, I would say, a misunderstanding and a misuse of this parable. And I say that because the reference to prayer in verse 1 seems to be a reference to praying for something in particular. And that is justice. Please note, it's no coincidence that one of the two characters in the story is a judge. And it's no coincidence that the other one is a widow who has suffered an injustice of some kind. It's no coincidence that our plea, verse 3, is grant me justice. And if you look at verse 8, you'll see that Jesus' application of this parable is he, that is God, will see that his people get everything they've asked for? No. He will see that his people get justice. The reason we read the previous passage is because the context is all about Jesus returning one day and judgment being executed or justice being done on that occasion. And so for those reasons, it's better to take the reference to persistent prayer in verse 1 to be a reference to persistently praying for justice. And why should we be praying for such a thing as Christian people? Because we live in a world that is often characterized by injustice. And it is often the Christian who's on the receiving end of that injustice. If you look back to chapter 7, verse 22, you'll hear Jesus telling his disciples that there will come a time when they will long for the return of their Saviour. And why will they long for that day? Well, in verses 26 and 28, he refers to two incidents from Old Testament history to illustrate his future coming, and both of them were historical situations in which it was very difficult to live for God in this world. Believers were very much in the minority, both in Noah's day and in Lot's day. And consequently, they were under enormous pressure to conform to the unbelief and the immorality which characterized their societies. And the reason he refers to those incidents is because it will be like that for believers in Jesus Christ in the period between his first and his second coming, i.e. the period that you and I are currently living in. Jesus is warning his disciples that life in this world won't be easy for them. And yet, it is within that context that they are to remain faithful to God rather than return to the world. That is why it is the warning to remember Lot's wife in verse 32, who did look back. And that is why there is the warning in verse 33, because this is the temptation. Whoever tries to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. Such warnings were necessary for those disciples back then and for us today, because living as a follower of Jesus Christ in this world is not easy. There is an enormous pressure to conform, and that pressure, especially in some parts of our world today, that pressure can often come in the form of unfair and unjust treatment for the believer living in an unbelieving world. For example, within the workplace, there can sometimes be a pressure from management to fiddle the figures, so to speak, in order to boost sales or in order to get the company out of a tricky situation. As a follower of Jesus Christ, you refuse to do that, and consequently, when opportunities for promotion come up, you are politely but repeatedly overlooked. It's not fair. And you long for the day when such injustices are addressed and such wrongs are put right. Or let's imagine that because you're not getting promoted, let's imagine you decide to relocate and you decide to live as a Christian in some other part of the world where the weather is much hotter than it is here. And what you discover when you get there, what you discover is that you and your family are disadvantaged on a daily basis. Regardless of how clever your kids are, it's the other kids in the class that get the opportunity of a good education or a higher education for the simple reason that those running the selection process are doing all that they can to discourage and to destroy your loyalty and your family's loyalty to Jesus Christ. It's not fair. It's not just. And you long for the day when such injustices are addressed and such wrongs are put right. But then, having relocated, you do what you should always do when you relocate to a new place, and that is you should look for a church. And having settled in a church in that place, you get to know some of the local Christians there. And if you think that you're sometimes treated unfairly as a foreigner there, then it's nothing compared to how they are treated. They're regularly arrested by the authorities and spend an overnight in prison for no other reason than the fact that they are Christians. And during that overnight stay in prison, it's not just a cheap alternative to bed and breakfast, you know. During that overnight stay in prison, they're beaten and they're tortured. I'm not making it up, by the way. This is how it is for Christians in many parts of our world today. They're beaten and they're tortured for no other reason than the fact that they're followers of Jesus Christ. It's not fair. It's unjust. And yet those are the sort of injustices which disciples of Jesus Christ face on a daily basis throughout our world. And consequently, they long to see the day when such injustices are dealt with and such wrongs are put right. They long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, to use the language of chapter 7, verse 22. They long for that day when the righteous judge of all the earth will come. And he will implement true and perfect justice. Followers of Jesus Christ back then in Jesus' day, and followers of Jesus Christ throughout our world today, know what it is to be treated badly, to be treated unfairly, to be treated unjustly, and consequently, they have a longing for justice to be done. And that is one of the reasons why the church throughout history has prayed, as our Lord taught us to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And that is why the cry of the martyrs in heaven, I don't know if you've ever read that passage, Revelation 6, verse 10, the cry of the martyrs in heaven, those who have died as a result of their faith in Jesus Christ and gone to be with Christ, their cry is, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" How long? And that is why the story of this dear woman was extremely relevant to those disciples back then and continues to be relevant to us today, because what we see in this woman is a similar desire for justice to be done. Secondly, the Christian's confidence that justice will be done. The Christian's confidence that justice will be done. In spite of being repeatedly ignored by the judge over a considerable period of time, this dear woman never gave up in her request for justice. She kept coming to him with the plea, "Grant me justice against my adversary." And we are told in verse 4, finally the judge said to himself, "Well, even though I don't fear God or care about men, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice so that she won't eventually wear me out with her coming." Now, please note, the change in this judge has not come about because his conscience has suddenly been awakened and he has rediscovered a God-given sense of right and wrong. No, that's not the reason. And it's not because he had a personality change and all of a sudden has become a nice charitable guy who wants to help the poor and the disadvantaged of society. No, that's not the reason. He himself acknowledges in verse 4 that he still does not fear about God or care about men. He still doesn't. Justice and compassion are still not on his radar. And so what is it that has brought about this sudden change in his attitude towards this woman? Well, listen to what he himself says in verse 5. "Because this widow keeps bothering me, I'll see that she gets justice so that she won't eventually wear me out." In other words, she's been pestering him. She's been bending his ear. Every time he went to the market to buy meat or fish or fruit, guess who popped up beside her? "Oh, by the way, sir, have you considered my request yet?" When he was at the bus stop in the morning waiting for the bus to go to the courtroom, who should appear at the bus stop but the dear woman? "Oh, nice to meet you, sir. Fancy meeting you here. Oh, by the way, have you had time to look at my case?" She's been pestering him, bending his ear. She's been nagging him to such an extent that he just cannot cope anymore with her nagging. That's what has motivated his change of mind. He's going to grant her justice for no other reason than a selfish desire for a quieter and a more peaceful way of life. If I can get rid of her, just think how much better life would be. And so although you may be relieved to hear that the widow is at last getting her justice, you may have serious misgivings about this judge's motives for granting it. And you might be thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, is that how the judiciary is supposed to reach its verdict? Just by who nags the longest? No, it's not. Of course it's not. And therefore, however little respect you had for this judge at the beginning of the story, you might have even less now. And yet, says Jesus in verse 6, listen to what the unjust judge says. Listen to him. Because however bad a judge he may be, he has something to teach you. That is why Jesus draws attention to him. He has something to teach us. He has something to teach us about, would you believe it, of all people, he's got something to teach us about God. Listen to what the unjudged judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? Now, one of the problems we have in reading the parables is that we often look for a like-for-like equivalent. And so for every character in the story, we want an exact equivalent in our spiritual understanding of the story. But the problem with that approach is that you're not always meant to have an exact equivalent. Yes, there are times when you're supposed to identify an equivalent, but even on some of those occasions, it's meant to be a contrasting equivalent rather than an identical equivalent. And so although the actions of this judge in the story teach us something about the actions of God, who is, don't forget, the judge, please don't allow the character of this judge in the story to shape your impressions of the judge. To walk away from this story with a view of God based on this guy would be a serious mistake to make. Rather than a similarity in character between God and this judge in the story, we are meant to see a contrast in character between God and this judge in the story. A contrast in character. It's the contrast between an earthly judge who did not have a moral bone in his body, let alone a backbone. It's a contrast between him and your God, who is the perfectly just and righteous judge of all the earth. What a contrast. The contrast is between an earthly judge who did not have an ounce of compassion for other people, and your God who has loved you from all eternity, and that is why you're described in verse 7 as being his elect or his chosen ones. The contrast between that judge and the judge, the contrast between that judge and your God could not be greater. And the point of this contrast is that if that cruel and callous and corrupt judge granted justice to this lady who persistently asked for it, will not, verse 7, will not a compassionate and infinitely just God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? If that judge eventually gave justice because she repeatedly asked, how much more will your righteous and just God give justice to his chosen people who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting us off? Of course not, says Jesus in verse 8. I tell you, he will see, your God, he will see that they get justice and get it quickly. And when will that happen? Well, don't forget that the previous context was all about the future return of Jesus Christ. And having told this little story, Jesus immediately refers to his future return again, end of verse 8. It's the occasion of his future return that surrounds this parable. The little story is sandwiched between references to the future return of Jesus Christ, and it is that occasion that Jesus is referring to when he says that God will see that justice is done. Well, in the meantime, we may obtain justice to some extent and on some occasions. And that is why there are a number of Christian organisations who are doing what they can to highlight the plight of Christians throughout the world who are being unjustly treated. And if you're not aware of what is happening in some parts of our world, then it's time you signed up to some emails from some of those organisations. And you might come to realise just what some of God's people are going through. And that is why the Christian Institute does all that it can to help Christians in this country who have been unfairly treated. And yes, there is a place for that. There is nothing wrong in doing what we can do to ensure that Christians both here and throughout our world are treated justly in the present, as long as we remember that we were never guaranteed by Jesus that we would be treated fairly or justly in this world. In fact, Jesus warned us about the very opposite. If they persecuted me, said Jesus, they will persecute you also. And so whatever measure of justice we do currently enjoy as Christians in this world, and we thank God for every demonstration of it, we must always remember that biblical promises of justice and biblical reassurances of justice for the Christian, such as this one here in this passage, are always given with a future day in view. Always. That day when the Son of Man will return to this earth and deal with his enemies and the enemies of his people once and for all. Oh yes, such a day is coming. And when Jesus says in verse 7 that it's coming quickly, that probably means that it's coming suddenly. The two examples of God's judgment in Old Testament times that are referred to in chapter 7, i.e. the flood, verse 27, and the destruction of Sodom in verse 29, both of those happened suddenly. Did you notice the descriptions? On both cases, people were going about their lives and going about their business as if they were here forever, when suddenly God stepped in judgment. And says Jesus in verse 30, it will be just like this on the day the Son of Man is revealed. And therefore, you and I need to make sure that we are ready for it, that we are prepared for that day. We need to make sure that we are prepared for that day, because if God is going to implement true and thorough and perfect and thoroughly consistent justice on that occasion, you think about it. If a perfect, just God is going to implement perfect, thoroughly consistent justice on that occasion, then it's not only the perpetrators of persecution who will have to stand before the judge of all the earth and give an account. We all will. We all will. And on that day, a perfectly just God will demand that sin of every description, including yours and mine, a perfectly just God will demand on that day that sin is punished. His just and righteous character, perfectly consistent. His just and righteous character could do nothing else. But the great news of this book, and if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, or you're not quite sure what biblical Christianity is all about, then however much you've zoned in and out of what I've said so far this morning, please just listen up for a minute. Because the great news of this book is that in his death upon the cross, Jesus was being punished for the sinner's sin. He, the sinless one, was being punished for the sinner's sin. And through trusting in what he has done, not trusting in my own goodness, not trusting in my church attendance, not trusting in my own better morality than other people, but trusting entirely what he has done. You and I, in view of how I've described that future day, you might be thinking to yourself, oof, it's going to be a frightening occasion. Yes, in one sense it is going to be a frightening occasion, but through trusting in what Jesus has done, you and I can look forward to that day with the assurance that our sins have already been punished and paid for in the person of Jesus Christ. God will be just. Sin will be punished. But if you're trusting in Jesus, you can make your way to that day with the assurance that your sin has already been punished. The punishment taken by someone else. And as Augustus Toplady, the great hymn writer, said in one of his hymns, listen to this. Payment, we're talking about a just God, remember, who will demand that sin is punished. But being a just God, payment God cannot twice demand. First at my bleeding's surety's hand, and then again at mine. It is by trusting in him and his death upon the cross to save us that we will be ready to meet our Maker, the Judge, on that future day, that day when final judgment will be executed. And in God's execution of final judgment, his believing and despised and disadvantaged and persecuted people throughout the world and throughout history will at last be vindicated and will see justice being done. That is the reassurance which this parable gives. But please note, rather than making his people have a fatalistic attitude towards that future day, the purpose of this little parable, don't forget, was, verse 1, that we should keep on praying about it and not give up praying about it. And so no matter how long that day seems to be coming, and we don't know when it's coming, by the way, but no matter how long that day seems to be in coming, we should not stop looking forward to it and longing for it and praying for it. Because as Jesus says at the very close of verse 8, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? In asking that question, Jesus is not doubting as to whether there will be any believers on the earth when he returns. Instead, he is asking whether his believing people will be demonstrating this type of faith when he returns, this type of faith that we've seen demonstrated by this widow in the story. Will he find that kind of faith amongst us when he returns? That faith which is crying out and longing, how long, Lord, till you return? How long till we see justice at last being done? Well, I suspect if he were to return tonight, he would find believers in certain parts of the world who are praying that prayer and exercising that faith. But the question is, if he were to return tonight, would he find us in the cosy, comfortable West exercising that kind of faith and praying that prayer? He's asking the question to indicate that this is the type of faith he would like to see amongst his people when he does finally return. He's asking the question as a means of encouraging his people and challenging his people to continue no matter how comfortable your life may be. He's asking us to encourage us to continue looking and longing and praying for that day when the Judge of all the earth will finally come. And the one thing that you can be sure of, and the one thing that you should be longing for, as this lady was, is that on that day, justice will at last be done. Two lessons we learn in the parable of the persistent widow. First, the Christian's desire for justice to be done, and secondly, the Christian's confidence that justice will be done.